Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is our time each week to take some really dense source material, filter through it, and give you the essential knowledge you need. We call it reformed thinking because it's all about clear thought built on a solid foundation.
It is.
And today we are taking on a deep dive into what might be the most, emotionally direct piece of literature in the entire biblical canon, the Book of Psalms.
We certainly are. And to guide us, we're using a study Bibles analysis. We're pulling excerpts from the Apologetics study Bible. Real questions, straight answers, stronger faith. It gives a really solid, authoritative introduction to the Psalter.
So our mission for you, the listener, is really threefold. We want you to grasp the raw, almost visceral historical context that produced these songs.
Yeah, you have to feel it.
Then to understand the unshakable theological conviction underneath it all. And finally, to see their absolute centrality to the messianic hope. That's the Christological significance that so many casual readers might miss.
And it's such a critical study because the Psalter is, well, it's entirely unique. It's recognized as the largest collection of ancient lyrical poetry that we have in existence.
The largest in existence.
Yeah. So this isn't just a book of, spiritual philosophy.
Yeah.
It's religious poetry that truly captures the inner life, the very breath of faith in the ancient world.
And when you really spend time in the Psalms, what hits you right away is just how human the authors are. These are the spontaneous emotions of believers.
Right.
Stirred by the reality of God and their relationship with him, whether that's going well or not so well. You see the whole spectrum of human experience laid bare.
Everything. The joy of victory, the paralyzing fear of your enemies, the confidence in deliverance, and then the abyss of absolute despair.
Yeah.
And that contrast is exactly why the Psalter is so captivating. It's intensely personal.
Mm-hmm.
It expresses emotion with this great honesty and boldness.
Brutal honesty.
Yes. Yet it's all contained within a framework of absolute piety and reverence toward God. The authors are being totally honest about their circumstances, but they remain doctrinally sound about the sovereignty of God.
It's the original spiritual wrestling match, isn't it? The psalmists aren't giving you some sanitized, clean version of devotion.
Not at all.
They're presenting the messy reality of living life under the truth of God's rule, even when that rule feels, confusing or very distant.
Mm-hmm.
It forces us to ask how our own theology handles suffering.
A crucial question.
So let's start there. Let's frame that reality. We can't really appreciate the intensity of the Psalms without understanding the daily life of the people who wrote them. This wasn't a world of comfort. You called it a crucible. What was that specific historical setting that fueled these intense writings?
Well, we have to completely discard any modern idea of safety or security. The psalmist lived in a highly volatile geopolitical area. Life was precarious. It was cheap.
So constant threat.
Constant. They were always in life and death situations. Think about the threats they faced. They were surrounded by these ruthless, cruel enemies. You have the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Arameans, who were frequently attacking, raiding, and besieging Israel.
And it wasn't just, organized state warfare, was it? They faced danger much closer to home.
Exactly. Even within their own community, they faced the constant shadow of betrayal by friends, false accusations, the threat of political intrigue designed to maybe usurp the king or tear down someone who was righteous.
Okay.
And then on top of all that, you just have the natural dangers. Traveling through a desert or mountain passes meant exposure to bandits, to wild animals, or a sudden drought. It was a hard life.
When you read something like Psalm 3, where David writes, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me." You can just feel that immediate present danger. It's not some abstract theological problem.
No, it's happening right now. The source material is very clear on this. There was no lasting peace, and certainly no sense of guaranteed security. Life was a daily challenge.
So if your external life is constantly unstable, you have to find stability somewhere else.
You have to. You have to find it internally, and you have to find it eternally.
And that brings us to the central conviction that makes all of these poems work. If life is that volatile, the anchor has to be absolutely firm. Where do the psalmists root their entire emotional and theological structure?
The anchor is this one conviction that the Lord reigns over the affairs of men. That is the central, non-negotiable theological assumption.
No matter what it looks like.
No matter what it looks like, even when the world feels like it is completely spinning out of control, when enemies are at the gate or, betrayal is at the dinner table, the psalmists are absolutely convinced of divine sovereignty.
So if the Lord reigns, that has to lead to some very specific, practical consequences for how you live your life, for your devotion. How does that certainty translate into action?
It dictates their spiritual and civil life completely. Because they believed the Lord reigned, they rejoiced over the law of God. That law was their guide. It was the stable element in their lives.
Uh-huh.
It provided order and truth and moral guidance when their physical environment was offering them nothing but chaos. So studying the law wasn't a burden for them. It was a sanctuary.
And that core conviction, that generates the entire spiritual rhythm of the Psalter, doesn't it? This cycle of praise and lament. How did this belief in God's sovereignty show up in their immediate responses to, say, success or failure?
You see two primary and sort of contrasting spiritual responses, and they're both rooted in that knowledge of God's sovereignty. First, when the Lord demonstrated his control through direct intervention, a military victory or healing or providing food, the response was immediate, jubilant praise.
Right.
They were celebrating the realized authority of God in their specific lives.
But the other half of that equation is the more challenging one. What happens when that intervention did not seem to be coming?
And that's where the incredible value of the lament psalms comes in. When God's intervention didn't appear, the psalmists didn't just abandon him. They lamented over their dilemmas. They poured out their hearts in this really earnest prayer.
They felt they could approach him.
They treated the sovereign God as someone they could approach with their fear, their anger, and their confusion.
This is where that bluntness we talked about at the beginning is so essential. When life seems unfair, they don't just, internalize the struggle. They project it onto God. They ask him these really difficult questions.
They wrestle publicly and privately with God's perceived decisions, or his lack of decisions. They analyze the wisdom of God's choices in the face of deep suffering or what looks like injustice. But here's the critical distinction. The struggle is always contained within the covenant.
Okay, that's key.
It is. They always return to reaffirming their hope in his loyal love and their commitment to serving him. So the questioning is a means to a deeper devotion, not a path to atheism.
The dynamic tension then. Acknowledging the reality of the pain while holding on to the truth of God's rule. This whole process, this cycle of wrestling and lamenting and then reaffirming hope, that must have had massive practical effects on the religious life of the whole nation.
It absolutely did. Because these poems captured the raw reality of faith, the genuine, documented experience of the faithful, this collection very quickly became the official prayer and hymn book of the temple.
So its function was twofold.
Yes, exactly. It provided the words for private piety, which allowed an individual to mourn or celebrate alone, but it also supplied the official liturgy for communal worship, especially at the great annual festivals.
So if a person was facing, say, personal betrayal, they could turn to a Psalm of David, who went through the exact same thing.
Right.
And when the nation itself was under siege, they had shared words to pray together for deliverance. It gives a voice to that common human experience, but it's filtered through a deeply theological lens.
That's a perfect way to put it. It systematized the emotional life of Israel, and it centered it around the altar. It made sure that all the primary emotional responses, from joy to utter despair, were always directed toward the Lord, who, even if he seemed absent, was nonetheless reigning.
Okay, that leads us perfectly into the organizational structure of the collection itself, which brings us to a major point of scholarly contention. Who wrote these works and when? And the argument really begins with the technical details, these little editorial notes at the head of many psalms.
Yes, the superscriptions, those little headings we often just glance over, like a Psalm of David or to the tune of the lilies.
Right, I'm guilty of that.
We all are. They were added by later editors of the collection, and their function was pretty varied.
So what were these editors trying to accomplish by adding them? What was the point?
They were trying to clarify the purpose of the composition. Sometimes they would indicate the melody that was required, or they'd name the performers. And crucially for this discussion, they frequently included notations of authorship.
But we need to be clear, these notes may not have been part of the original scroll written by, say, David himself.
That's right. They might not be original to the composition, but what they do is record the ancient traditions about that psalm's origin and its use.
So even if they were added later, they're reflecting the established historical memory of the Israelites about their own literature, which means we should take them seriously as a piece of evidence.
Absolutely. To just dismiss them out of hand is to dismiss the entire historical understanding of the community that preserved the text for centuries. They represent the internal commentary of Israel on its own hymn book.
Okay, so let's contrast the two big views. The traditional view, the one that's maintained by these superscriptions, against the counter-arguments from more critical scholarship.
The traditional view, which is very strongly supported by the Hebrew text itself, is that King David wrote at least half of the Psalms. Specifically, 73 of them are attributed to him using the phrase of David.
So that establishes him as the central primary author and, I guess, the musical architect of the whole project.
It does. But as you said, critical scholars often push back very hard on this. They argue for a much later dating for most of the collection.
What's their reasoning?
It's pretty standard in historical critical studies. They often want to date the majority of the collection to the post-exilic period, so after the return from Babylon in the 5th century BC.
That's a long time after David.
Centuries, or even as late as the Maccabean period, which is around 150 BC. If they're right, that makes the superscriptions attributing them to David very dubious.
And this whole technical debate, it really comes down to one tiny linguistic detail, doesn't it? The interpretation of a single Hebrew preposition.
It really does. This is the crux of the linguistic debate. The Hebrew preposition lamed. If you read the superscription, it is literally Lin David.
Pre-Ned David. Okay.
Critical scholars argue that because lamed most frequently means for or to in other contexts, a phrase like Lin David should be translated as dedicated to David, or maybe for use in a service commemorating David, rather than the traditional written by David.
So it's a semantic argument that completely shifts the responsibility. It moves it from author to, I guess, beneficiary. And if you adopt that translation across the board, then suddenly half the book is stripped of its Davidic origin.
That's the effect.
What is the most skeptical view of the superscriptions altogether?
The most skeptical wing of modern scholarship would just write them off as spurious additions. They'd say they are pious but ultimately fictional attempts by later editors to assign famous names to anonymous texts.
So they're just making it up to add credibility.
That's the argument. They might concede that David wrote a handful of compositions, but they would maintain that the vast majority were written much later, and that even the authentic Davidic ones were heavily edited and revised over time to fit later liturgical needs. This approach really minimizes the role of divine inspiration acting through a specific historical author.
And this is where the Study Bible's analysis becomes so valuable, because it lays out 4 very strong lines of evidence that sustain the traditional view, that David did author many of these psalms, and that the collection started much, much earlier than the Maccabean period. Let's walk through those counterarguments.
Okay, the first line of evidence is simple historical and scriptural attestation. The Bible itself, in its narrative texts, attests that David wasn't just a king and a warrior. He was a documented singer, a composer, and vitally, the primary organizer of temple music and the worship structures.
Yeah, we see that specifically in 2 Samuel 6, which
Right.
details all his musical efforts. And then you get these really detailed records in 1 Chronicles 15, 16, and 23, showing him establishing the Levitical orders, the instruments, the duties of the singers. He wasn't just a poet. He was basically the head of the National Music Department.
Correct. That establishes him as the credible source and the chief influence on the entire corpus of work. The second line of evidence is the New Testament's use of the Psalms.
Okay.
The New Testament frequently cites passages from the Psalter and directly attributes Davidic authorship to them, and sometimes it just uses his name generally to refer to the whole book.
Right, the New Testament quotes Psalm 110, for example, and explicitly links it back to David as the speaker. It views the text as a direct prophecy spoken by the king himself. So for us, adhering to the authority of Scripture, that confirms the traditional view of authorship from the earliest Christian perspective. We have to take that seriously.
We do. The third point addresses the critical argument that the Psalms just look late. The literary style of the Psalms, the distinctive use of parallelism, the meter, the vocabulary, it isn't unique to the post-exilic period at all. In fact, this specific poetic style is identical to Canaanite poetry that dates from about 400 years before David.
So critics can't claim the poetry is stylistically too sophisticated or too modern to be from David's time. The style was already ancient when David was writing.
Precisely. There is no linguistic or stylistic reason inherent in the poems themselves to date the collection centuries later. The style is perfectly suited to the early kingdom period, or even earlier, as we see with Moses' Psalm 90.
And that final piece of evidence, it comes back to that tricky lamed preposition. How does the linguistic evidence support lamed as an indicator of authorship, which would challenge that critical reading?
The key here is that lamed is a highly flexible preposition. There's evidence both within the Bible, we see it used in Habakkuk 3.1 to link the prophet's prayer to the choir director, and outside the Bible.
Outside the Bible.
Yes, in early Hebrew ostraca. These are shards of pottery that were used for casual writing, like notepads, and they support the use of lamed as an indicator of the author or the sender of a message or a document.
That is vital. If layment is a legitimate way to deny authorship in the ancient world, then we have no compelling external reason to reject the ancient tradition that 73 of these psalms came directly from his hand.
It remains the most credible reading, especially when you factor in all the scriptural testimony. And if we assume that the lamed of authorship holds, then we get to appreciate this really diverse assembly of authors that contributed to this national hymn book over many, many centuries.
Let's quickly detail some of the other credited authors beyond David. It's really a snapshot of Israel's history.
The list is remarkable. You have Moses credited with the prayer of Psalm 90, which speaks to the brevity of human life and the eternity of God. David, of course, is the cornerstone with 73 psalms.
Okay.
Then you have the musical guilds. Asaph or his descendants contributed a whole block of psalms, Psalms 50 and 73 through 83, and they were crucial temple functionaries.
Right.
Then Heman the Ezrahite wrote Psalm 88, which is one of the darkest psalms, and Ethan the Ezrahite wrote Psalm 89. Even David's son, Solomon, is credited with Psalms 72 and 127, which often focus on wisdom and kingship.
And the rest are just anonymous, so we have to acknowledge that the book spans this enormous time frame, from Moses all the way through to post-captivity writers like the author of Psalm 126, celebrating the return from exile.
It is truly a multi-generational, century-spanning work of inspiration. And just to be clear, lamed does appear in superscriptions for other non-authorial uses. You'll see things like for the choir director or for the sons of Korah, but the surrounding tradition and the context strongly argue for authorship in the many Davidic cases.
So we've established the authors and the context. Let's look now at the function and the form of the book. The very name of the book, in Hebrew, tells us something really fundamental about how it was intended to be used.
It does. The title we use most often in the Book of Psalms actually comes from the Greek translation, the Septuagint. The Greek word psalmos refers to a composition that's sung to stringed instruments, and that reflects the Hebrew word mizmor.
But the original Hebrew title is Tehillim, which is usually translated as the Book of Praises.
And that is far more fitting for the content. The collection is called Praises because almost every single psalm, no matter how it starts, includes praise in some capacity. This reveals the theological center of the book. All paths, even the paths through the darkest valleys, eventually lead to a celebration of brighter goodness.
So even when the author is crying out in absolute distress, that final theological destination is always praise. That's the lament to praise arc that's built right into the spiritual architecture of the book.
It is.
How does that arc typically play out within a single psalm?
It's a very deliberate rhetorical and spiritual movement. A lament psalm often begins with the plea for help. Then it moves into a description of the distress, maybe a complaint against enemies or a question directed at God. But then it transitions, often dramatically, into an expression of faith and a promise of future praise.
So the praise is offered before the answer is received. It's a vow of faith.
Precisely. The psalmist expresses confidence in God's character and his loyal love, and then offers a vow of praise that will be fulfilled in the sanctuary once deliverance arrives. It's a progression from the present pain to a future hope, and it's all grounded in the past faithfulness of God. It shows that spiritual resilience is a conscious act of theological affirmation.
This inherent structure makes perfect sense of why the Psalter was so quickly adopted as the official temple liturgy.
Absolutely. Because the Psalms articulated the deepest religious ideas of Israel with such authenticity, they were almost immediately integrated into the public services. They provided the template for how to interact with the divine.
And they consistently celebrate the mechanism of worship itself. The lines are always exulting in the privilege of entering God's courts, drawing near to his altar, and participating in the ordinances of the sanctuary ritual. They're celebrating the place where heaven meets earth.
Yes, they formed the very liturgy of the temple. They governed how individuals and communities spoke to God during the great festivals. And this system then carried forward, becoming the standard hymn book and prayer manual for the early Christian church.
To really understand the spiritual impact, we have to recognize the literary form here. We are dealing with poetic discourse, not straightforward historical narration.
Yeah.
What are the distinct elements that make reading this ancient hymn book so unique?
Poetic discourse is, it's concentrated communication. It uses consciously artistic elements that are designed to evoke specific emotional and intellectual responses.
Okay.
This includes vivid images, often military or agricultural symbols, figures of speech, and very emotive vocabulary. We have to recognize that words in these poems often carry multiple layers of meaning.
So we can't interpret these lines purely literally as if they were prose. The figurative language is doing a different kind of work.
It's doing essential work. Figurative language conveys emotional and intellectual connotations that straight declarative prose just cannot. It draws heavily on the shared culture and history of the people. Allusions to the Exodus, to the chaos of creation, to the stability of Mount Zion, things that an ancient listener would instantly grasp.
And that requires a critical shift in perspective for us as modern readers. To fully grasp the emotional and spiritual impact, we have to try and sense Israel's experience living among those pagan neighbors who are constantly trying to destroy them.
We have to put ourselves back into that life or death context. If you feel surrounded by enemies, like in Psalm 59, your praise isn't theoretical. It's desperate and it's triumphant, because you're anticipating a real physical deliverance. Understanding this context helps us appreciate both the urgency of their lament and the fervency of their hope for the Lord to finally establish his reign over all the nations.
And that leads directly to the musical component. These were designed not for quiet, private contemplation, but for active communal use. They were meant to be sung.
They are hymns and prayers designed to be vocalized and accompanied by instruments. The book is saturated with references to music and instruments. The superscriptions themselves sometimes contain instructions, telling the performers which instruments to use or which tune to follow, even if those tunes are now lost to us.
Beyond the spiritual joy of it, the musical setting had a tremendously practical benefit, especially for an oral culture.
That's the essential insight. The meter, the repetition, and the musical accompaniment served a crucial function. They fixed the words in the minds of the people more effectively than any other literary form ever could.
It's a memory aid.
A powerful one. Singing makes the content memorized, it becomes internalized, and it's readily available for spontaneous prayer or meditation or even for warfare. It was the most effective way to disseminate theological truth throughout the entire population.
Okay, so having established the context, the authorship, and the function, let's look at the history of scholarship around the Psalter, because that has heavily influenced how modern readers approach it.
Historically, the initial study of the Psalms focused very narrowly on dogma, just extracting theological concepts without much regard for the original setting in Israelite worship.
Right.
After the Reformation, we saw the rise of what's called higher criticism.
We should probably define that for our listener. What exactly is higher criticism?
Higher criticism is a term used generally for academic approaches that investigate the literature, the source, the date, and the authorship of biblical texts. It often uses modern tools like philology, which is the study of language in historical sources.
Right.
And while it led to some technical insights, in the case of the Psalms, it often led scholars to these late dating models. They'd argue that the historical events described were too complex to be early, or that the poetic language must be late, just like we saw with the lambed argument.
In that focus on dating and philology, it often stripped the text of its spiritual authority for some readers. But the source notes that form-critical studies provided a more positive turn.
Form criticism, which emerged in the early 20th century, was revolutionary. It shifted the focus from purely dating the text to recognizing the ancient literary forms and their intended ritual functions within Israel's communal life. It helped systematize our understanding by identifying distinct psalm types.
These types, laments, declarative praises, enthronement psalms, royal psalms, they provided a typology, a way to organize and understand how the collection was actually used in worship.
Precisely. However, form criticism wasn't without its own pitfalls. Many of its practitioners tried to trace the development of each psalm backward, trying to reconstruct every single editorial step, deciding which lines were written earlier and which were later additions.
Which I imagine is a task that's basically doomed to failure, given the lack of source manuscripts.
It's impossible, and the source material stresses that it's ultimately unnecessary for theological study. Our focus must be on the canonical text, the final, authoritative text that was delivered to the church. We study the inspired word as it exists, not some theoretical, reconstructed early version of it.
This focus on the final authoritative text brings us to the main organizing theme that modern biblical theology has identified in the Psalter.
And that theme is the reign of the Lord. The entire collection, from the creation psalms to the royal psalms, is organized around the affirmation that God is sovereign and the fervent desire for that reign to be established over all creation in heaven and on earth.
So the Psalms become a liturgy that's demanding God's justice and his rule.
They celebrate every step in the establishment of that reign, past acts of salvation, present acts of deliverance, and future hope. Their prayers are, in essence, petitions for the full manifestation of God's authority in a fallen world.
And within this framework of the reign of the Lord, the hope of the great coming king, the Messiah, begins to emerge with dramatic clarity.
Yes, the hope of the great coming king, who would fully execute the Lord's reign, appears in specific passages with striking clarity. And this is the crucial intersection for the Christian reader, because those passages dealing with kingship and final victory speak so clearly of the person and work of Jesus the Messiah.
This is the Christological link, and it's a fascinating piece of divine design. So many Psalms point to Christ, functioning as prophecies, describing his suffering, his death, his resurrection, or even providing a perfect description of his obedient life lived amidst constant persecution.
The term we often use is dual fulfillment. David is writing about his own historical suffering, yet the Spirit of God is directing his pen in such a way that the words are too large for David alone. They find their perfect, complete fulfillment only in Christ.
A perfect example being,
Consider Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? David certainly felt that sense of abandonment, but only Christ realized it completely and literally on the cross.
but here's the critical, almost surprising detail that elevates this entire discussion. The recognition of these messianic passages was not something invented by Christians after the fact.
This is perhaps the most profound theological insight from the sources. Many of these so-called messianic passages were recognized and treated as such by Jewish interpreters before Jesus was born.
That's a game changer. It means the expectation of a suffering and reigning king, derived from the Psalter, was already embedded in first-century Jewish thought.
It absolutely validates the Christian interpretation as being rooted in the Old Testament's own intention. It prevents the argument that these are just Christian readings being superimposed onto older texts. The Spirit was guiding Jewish scholars to see the prophetic thread long before the king ever arrived. They saw the blueprint, they just missed the builder.
The conclusion then has to be that the Spirit of God was directly guiding the psalmists, especially David, so that the words they used to describe their immediate historical circumstances were simultaneously designed by God to be fulfilled perfectly in the person and work of the Son of God, in his first coming to suffer, and in his second coming in glory to reign.
It's divine coherence at its highest level. The text functions perfectly for the historical believer, giving them words for their historical crisis, while at the same time operating as a detailed prophecy about the final victorious king. It's a dual design for a dual application.
Finally, as we consider the authority of this text, we need some assurance about its preservation. Since these writings span over 1,000 years, how certain can we be that the text we read today accurately reflects the original compositions?
We have substantial agreement regarding the text. The Hebrew original is largely preserved in what we call the Masoretic text, or the MT. The MT is recognized as the superior text type because of the meticulous preservation tradition used by the Masoretes, who were Jewish scribes that standardized and copied the text over centuries.
And what evidence do we have that confirms the superiority and the reliability of the MT?
The most powerful confirmation came from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century. These scrolls provided manuscript evidence that dates back centuries earlier than the earliest copies of the MT we previously had.
Okay.
And crucially, the text that was preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that the Masoretic tradition had preserved the text with tremendous accuracy. It affirmed its authenticity.
So those ancient manuscripts, they act as a kind of timestamp, assuring us that the text tradition is reliable. What about the Greek translation, the Septuagint?
The Septuagint, or the LXX, is serviceable. That means it generally captures the sense of the verses. However, it often softens the rugged originality of the Hebrew. Sometimes it uses more general words instead of precise ones, and occasionally it simplifies difficult grammatical constructions. It's a translation that sometimes clarifies rather than strictly preserves the original precision.
And yet, when the New Testament quotes the Psalter, it frequently uses that Greek translation. So why would the inspired apostles rely on what might be a less precise translation?
Because the New Testament writers were primarily communicating to a widened Greek-speaking world across the entire Roman Empire. While the Greek phrasing may not always have been verbally precise in its translation, it captured the theological sense and the application that was required for the New Testament exposition.
So it was a practical choice.
The practical choice, guided by the Spirit. They used the most widely accepted vehicle to convey the truth of the fulfillment of those ancient scriptures to their immediate audience.
It really speaks to the faithfulness of God, that both the source text and the widely used translations were adequate to convey the truth of the Messiah's coming. This has been an incredibly in-depth exploration. To bring this back to the learner, the core takeaway is this. The Book of Psalms is not just a casual collection of nice spiritual poems. It is warfare literature. It was generated in the crucible of real life, and it's absolutely rooted in the conviction of the total sovereignty of God. It was written by diverse voices across millennia, with David serving as the primary composer and musical organizer.
And its genius lies in its dual application. They were the historical hymns of Israel, expressing every honest emotion in times of crisis and joy. Yet they were simultaneously designed by God to foresee and testify to the reign and the saving work of the Messiah, Jesus Christ.
The Psalter gives us the vocabulary we need to face our own trials, but it also prepares us to meet the King.
Right, and think about the implication of that dual fulfillment concept. Since the Spirit of God directed these words to fit both the historical struggle of David and the perfect life and suffering of Christ, we can actually view the Psalter as the Messiah's own prayer book. These are the words he would have used, and in fact did use, to face his life of obedience and his eventual crucifixion.
So if the Psalter is the prayer book of our King, how should reading it as his words elevate our understanding of our own adoption into his kingdom? And when we face betrayal or sickness or fear, how does viewing our current daily challenges through the lens of King David's honest struggle, knowing the end of the story is the Messiah's complete return to reign? How does that change our perspective on our own struggles? That's the question to contemplate as you return to this incredible text.